Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. What could be better than maliciously complying in front of your boss that'll cause thousands of dollars of damage to the company, even though you warned him about it? Our first story tells you exactly about this situation. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Just run the parts? Sure thing, boss. I work as a machinist for an oil and gas company. I receive metal forgings and machine them for use in oil and gas pipelines. These special forgings are used in the manufacture of several different parts, relevant, and are rather expensive. One day, I received a batch of forgings that were out of spec. If I were to machine them, the result would be a part that's out of spec and not fit for use. An angularity issue for those in manufacturing that are curious, and in a pressurized pipeline, an out-of-spec part can have serious consequences. I went to my boss and told him that the forgings are out of spec and that I can't run them for this part. Since the forgings are so expensive, I can save them for another part where the specs are not as critical. Boss, how do you know the forgings are out of spec? Me, I measured them. Boss, how did you measure them? Me, with a protractor. It's a tool to measure angles. Boss, why would you do that? Me, because I'm a machinist and that's literally my job. Boss, well, they've been signed off as good by other manager and we need these parts, so run them. Me, whatever you say, boss. At the end of the night, I had to scrap 12 parts, a couple $1,000s each. I turn in my scrap report at the end of the day, and boss loses his crap, wants to know why I had so much scrap. Really? Because you told me to run bad forgings, a-hole. The next morning, I get into work before boss. There waiting for me are boss's boss and boss's boss's boss. Both want to know what happened. I explained the forgings were out of spec. They want to know why the forgings weren't safe for another job. I explained boss's command to run them anyway. I think I got lucky that they heard my side first since I didn't have any proof. I believe they were prepared to write me up for such waste. As far as I know, nothing happened to boss. Corporate America. Any boss that asks you why you did something and your only available reply is, "That's literally my job," is a terrible boss. And our second story. A flight attendant screamed at my grandfather. I was 17 at the time and my sister was 12. We were going on family vacation with my mom and grandparents. We had all taken our seats on the plane and the flight attendant was going over the usual safety protocol. After his spiel, he walked down the aisle to check everything was in its appropriate place, but came to a halt when he reached my row. I was seated on the left side of the aisle with my mother and grandmother, while my grandpa and sister opposite. I should mention that it was near the back end of the plane and was not an emergency exit row. Additionally, my grandfather had the window seat and my sister the aisle. She's weird, I know. What kid doesn't want the window? The steward, balding white guy, probably mid-40s, leaned down to my sister and said something along the lines of, "Honey, how old are you?" To which my sister replied, 12. He then said, "Okay, and how much do you weigh?" To which my grandfather confusedly replied, "Why? Why does her weight matter?" At this point, the steward stood upright and began raising his voice. "How dare you look at me like I'm a lecherous man? I need to know her weight because she's a child that's sitting in the aisle. There are strict guidelines about flight that you will never know. And for you to assume that I asked that question with some ulterior motive is horrible. I could have you kicked off the plane. Do you know that? So you better watch what you say." At this point, everyone on the plane had turned and was watching. I was across the aisle with rage boiling over. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to stand up and punch the steward right in the face for berating my grandfather. Before I could do or say anything, I came to the realization that he was right. He had complete control of the situation, because if I were to react in any way, that'd be the end of the vacation. We'd be kicked off the flight, put on a no-fly list, arrested, or any other list of things. As I watched my grandfather sit in shock, I realized that he came to the same realization because he didn't say a word in response, but proceeded to stare at the chair in front of him with the sternest look I've ever seen. The entire scene came to an end when the steward, forcing an answer out of my sister, who was now mortified and crying, "Well, I can't remember the number," she said, the steward replied, "That's fine." Now, that wasn't so hard, was it? Before he continued down the aisle. As we were exiting the plane, I allowed my family to disembark ahead of me, and as I passed the steward on the way out, I was sure to ask his name and tell him to go F himself. Fast forward to 10 days later when we returned home. My mother, still furious about the man, like all of us, calls the airline to explain what had happened. The representative listens to the whole story in details before informing my mother that the steward already had several complaints against him, including a few from other passengers about the same exact instance. She continues that the man had already been fired and they were awarding us with free miles that were equal to that trip in which the event occurred. We're not the type of family that wants someone to lose their job over a mistake, but we felt more than justified due to the extent to which the steward reacted. All in all, we felt that the man got what he deserved, but I still feel angry. And our final story. I trump your sergeant with a chief. So, a little backstory. I've been an electrician for almost 30 years. About 25 years or so ago, I worked at the big Orange Apron do-it-yourself store. I liked helping people, and I've seen a lot of do-it-yourselfers make some dangerous electrical mistakes. Making electrical mistakes could cause a fire or kill someone. I like to give them advice and show them how to do it right. I would gauge people while speaking to them, and sometimes I would just say, "You're better off hiring an electrician." Sometimes they'd ask me if I could do it, but I never used that as a work opportunity. Call me crazy, but I never thought it was right to try to get work that way. I didn't want people to think I was trying to get them to hire me. I'd recommend local decent electricians in the area that I knew were stand-up guys and didn't push them to just one electrician. I usually didn't work in the area that I lived. I worked there for a couple of years until I just got tired and needed to spend more time with the family. So, of course, every time I would go to the store after that, other associates would direct people to me that had questions. I would always oblige, unless the person was totally rude. I have a pure hatred for people being rude and ignorant towards others. It's like a switch flips inside my head and my buffer goes away and no one knows, including myself, what I'll say or do. It also seems the older I get, the faster the switch gets flipped. I usually have a longer fuse when they're acting like that with me for some reason. Now the story. I was in the Orange Apron store last Saturday. I was getting some supplies to do some electrical work at a buddy's home he'd just moved into. While I was there, I noticed an older gentleman, I think he had to be at least 70, looking a bit confused. He was looking at breakers and panels. I stopped and asked if he needed help. He joked, asking if I could tell by the look of determination on my face. We both chuckled and proceeded to talk about his project. He was helping his son install a hot tub for his grandson's new house as a wedding gift. We got to talking, and I got him on track to get everything he needed. After we just kept talking about life in general. I love speaking to older people, as they've seen more in life. As we were deep in conversation about old stores that were around years and years ago, I hear a snapping of fingers and a clearing of the throat. I turn to my right, and there she is, the wild Karen. She was in her 30s. As we look at her, she blurts out, "When you're done with that old guy, I need help, and I've been watching you waste time with him." I kinda smile at her and turn back to the older guy. She proceeds to continuously snap her fingers and yell, "Hello!" So I turn to her and snap my fingers and return the "hello." Then we both laughed at her. Well, this enraged the Karen. She steps closer to us and starts to yell, "How dare you! You're going to lose your job today." Well, I'm not one to tell someone that I'm not employed here, as if you're too dense to realize I'm not wearing a bright orange apron. I'm not going to waste my breath. She keeps rambling on, loudly. I, at this point, have had enough. As she started to insult the other fella, I proceeded to snap my fingers and said in a stern voice, "F off." All of a sudden, the waterworks started to flow. We looked at each other and just shook our heads at the spectacle this Karen was making. All of a sudden, a guy pops out of nowhere. She starts crying to him how we verbally abused her. We started to laugh at her as the guy flashes a badge and proceeds to tell us he's a local cop, a sergeant, and her husband. He then says if we don't apologize, he'll arrest us. Now, I'm very aware of laws and such and wasn't about to apologize. The old guy beats me to it and says, "As my friend told your wife, F off." I look at him and couldn't help but chuckle and have admiration for the older guy. Just as the sergeant was starting to approach us, another fella around my age comes bopping around the corner. The sergeant seemed to get more arrogant as the guy got closer. The sergeant says, "Hey, Chief, could you call a unit for these two while I cuff them?" The chief looks at him, then looks at us and says, "Dad, did you get everything for the hot tub?" Then he turns to the sergeant, and as the color drained from his face, the sergeant says, "This is your dad?" The chief says, "You're not even a detective and you figured it out." The chief then says, "I've been in the next aisle for over 10 minutes listening to you and your wife harass my dad and his friend." He then says, "I think you and your wife need to go home, and I want to see you in my office at 0800 tomorrow morning." It was hilarious watching the sergeant drag his wife away, telling her to shut up as she was still hurling insults. I think the sergeant finally got through to he's a few aisles away as all of a sudden you hear her say, "OMG." The three of us ended up chatting for about 30 minutes after that before we all went our separate ways. I wish there was video of this. Shut them both down. I sure hope he got a reprimand placed in his file for abuse of power. Imagine two men being arrested for telling a Karen where to go. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.